In this video, I'm going to react to if the US military is strong enough to defeat China on its own. Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. This is the place where I react to music, media, sports, anime, anything related to popular culture. I'll watch it with an open mind and give you my 100% honest reaction to it. And if you could please hit that like button early, I'd really appreciate it. Now, this should genuinely be a fascinating video because this is a question that I'm sure a lot of people, particularly right now, are considering just because of the deal that was announced, I believe it was last week, the AUKUS deal between the US, the UK and Australia. You know, just from what I've gathered, you know, considering how, you know, almost willingly Australia kind of abandoned the submarine deal they had with France, kind of shows that perhaps, you know, things, I don't know, maybe they could be escalating. Who knows? I was listening to a really fascinating interview on the radio, a well-known UK radio channel, where they had the former deputy head, the former deputy chief of MI6, which is basically the UK's international agency, secret service agency. And the radio presenter asked him, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, in the next 5 years, where would he place the chances of a potential conflict between, you know, US, UK, Australia, etc., and China? And he said 8, which is obviously, you know, quite a scary thought. But yeah, this video, like, I'm sure a lot of people are probably wondering if things came to a head, you know, imminently, you know, what could be the likely outcome we could expect. You know, I have no idea really. We all know how, you know, powerful the US military is. You know, I think by most metrics it's the strongest in the world. However, you know, it's undeniable that China's military has, over the last 20 years, massively strengthened in a lot of ways. So yeah, this channel, Binkov's Battlegrounds, does a tremendous job of, you know, doing these kind of war games where he poses different militaries around the world against each other and sees which ones come out on top. So let's go. This is going to be me reacting to if the US military is strong enough to defeat China on its own. Let's do it.
China seems to be in the US crosshairs a lot lately, but this video isn't about politics. Hypothetically speaking, if all this political posturing does result in a hot war between the two, just how much damage could the US do to China? Is marching with a land army to Beijing an option? And what would it take for such a wild operation, bringing the war to mainland China, to succeed?
Let's go.
The US and China's war would likely pull other countries into the conflict.
Absolutely. You know, we would be right there with America. You know, that goes without saying, and as would a lot of other Western nations.
While actual results are hard to predict, they're interesting to model in games, like in Conflict of Nations, sponsor video. Back to our hypothetical war. The future is unpredictable, so this war is set to late 2020. Taking Chinese mainland is a complex topic, so much so that the crucial geopolitical aspect of it all will be discussed in a separate later video. China has a bigger ground force in terms of active soldiers. The US National Guard is a combat reserve formation, but with more training than usual reserves, US or Chinese ones, as the rest are mostly support units, not combat units.
I see.
The Chinese militia reservist formation also has some 2 million armed troops doing at least some training.
Wow.
But all those figures would not come into play until the air war and war on the seas are settled. The US has quite a bit more active service planes. Chinese figures are realistic case estimates. Neither side has reserve units planes included, except for the US Air National Guard units, as those are closer to active service quality. The technological edge is also apparent. The US has 13 times more stealth planes,
Wow.
almost 4 times more fighters with modern radars, and almost 2 times more large fighters. On the seas, the disparity is even more pronounced.
Yeah, the US definitely, even without Binkov saying it, I'm sure the US has something like 12 Ford-class aircraft carriers, and I think China has around 2, I think?
The list shows only commissioned ships.
11.
The carriers are not so useful to China
I wasn't too far away, 11 and 2.
in a defensive role. US ships are generally bigger and carry more weapons, though China has many more coastal ships which could interfere with US Navy assaults.
I see.
Submarine numbers are almost the same, but Chinese subs are smaller and less advanced. A big issue for the US is access to nearby ports and air bases. Without those, the US force projection might drop quite a bit. This video will assume Japanese cooperation when it comes to US bases. Other variants of the scenario with more or fewer allies will be covered in a later video. The US carrier fleet would provide only a smaller part of the overall US combat aircraft numbers. Any big ship needs a lot of downtime. Even if most could be surged at once, that would be detrimental to later numbers, important in a long-term war against China. Planes too need maintenance. Realistically, there might be only 4 to 6 air wings on 4 to 6 carriers near China once the US is ready to start its attack. And if 6 are surged, that number would likely keep falling during the first year due to downtime issues. Similarly, 4 or 5 small carriers would be the limit for the likes of the Harrier or F-35B, if used as carriers. But those ships might be more effective as assault ships, with just a few jets each.
I'm not sure if I missed this, but I would assume that the use of nuclear weapons is prohibited in this scenario, just because, you know, mutual destruction would be assured, right? It just would render both places completely destroyed. So I would assume that there's no nukes.
Basically, some 400 combat planes would be the top limit the US could field from their carriers. On the other hand, the US Air Force already has that many planes near China, most of those in its Japanese bases and on Guam. As the naval forces assemble near China, the US Air Force could add a few thousand more land-based aircraft in various existing bases.
Wow.
But also new bases in Japan and perhaps even Australia.
Having that base in Japan, having cooperation with Japan would be so valuable to the US. Like just having a nearby geographical outpost.
Various commercial airports repurposed into combat air bases would be a common feature. Perhaps even new additional runways and whole bases might spring up within months. The US might eventually be fielding over 2,000 combat planes on Japanese soil. Basically all of the US Air Force, if needed. So the basing area would not be an issue if Japan can be counted on. But the issue of distance would still remain.
Really?
To reach the Chinese coast, there is still the East China Sea to cover. Bases like those on Okinawa are very close by, but that also means they would be the first to be hit by China. It's unlikely such bases would survive. Also, China is a big country. Reaching one part doesn't mean the same plane could easily reach another part of China. While the Shanghai region would be the most exposed to the US attacks, the approach to Beijing, for example, would be protected by land masses left and right. Even in-air refueling could not really help there, as trying to refuel just a few hundred miles of Chinese coasts would likely end in tanker interceptions. And trying to provide air superiority anywhere in southern China would be extremely hard due to the extreme distances. Now, all these distances, even doing 1,000 miles, let alone crossing 2,000 miles from Tokyo to Hainan Island, are very hard to do for most planes. The realistic combat radius of most planes would be 500 to 800 miles, when taking into account bomb loads, supersonic dashes, and possible low-altitude approaches to targets. But that's before the US starts to use its one massive advantage: its vast fleet of in-air refueling tankers. Using those, the US would be able to effectively double or sometimes almost triple the stated range figures.
But what about if China tried to attack those? Because that wouldn't be out of the question, would it? Unless they have some kind of maybe detection, like radar detection and some kind of defense against incoming projectiles, maybe?
The capacity figure shown is a theoretical one. At any given time, there would be only a few hundred planes in the air at once. Still, it's evident that with, say, 2 refuelings on the way out and 2 more on the way back for each plane, even the South China Sea could be covered. Such extreme missions would be impossible to sustain on a prolonged massive scale, and would likely be used for strikes on fixed targets. Fighter combat air patrol, interceptions, or striking targets of opportunity would not work over such distances. All those tanker planes would be quite vulnerable to various Chinese missile strikes.
Exactly.
They're very large and quite hard to protect or even hide. They might partially hide amongst various parked commercial airliners though. But extreme distance cuts both ways. Placing those tankers away from China would cut into their refueling capability, but it might protect them, as China doesn't actually have that many standoff missiles of long reach. Their impressive arsenal is primarily designed against closer targets, such as Taiwan. When targeting the Tokyo area or Guam, only a few hundred ballistic missiles would be able to reach them. Of course, the calculus changes for targets in Japan if Russia, for example, just tacitly allows Chinese to shoot over their territory. It would be very hard to keep this kind of war from growing into a world war. Trying to hunt down all the launch platforms would be impossible in a timely manner, but the US would more than reciprocate with its own standoff missile arsenal. Most cruise missiles...
So far, it does seem that technologically at least, the US has the edge, but I think the vastness of China, like just the sheer mass of the country, would pose a really difficult task in terms of trying to actually conquer the country. I'm kind of forming already an idea of how this is going to end, but I'm not going to say.
Are subsonic and easier to shoot down if flying a straight route to target. In practice, their useful range would be less, as they fly various roundabout routes. Ballistic missiles do fly a straight route, maximizing range. They rely on their very high speed and altitude to avoid interceptions. But the US has been developing anti-ballistic missile systems against such weapons. Systems such as Patriot PAC-3 would try to protect against shorter-ranged and slower ballistic missiles. THAAD batteries and Aegis SM-3 missiles would protect against the really fast missiles. The Navy's BMD ships would be crucial for protecting various land sites, augmenting other defenses. All such systems would only try to intercept the incoming missiles, with various success rates. THAAD and SM-3 had roughly 80% success rate in testing. In actual war conditions with saturation attacks, it's likely 2 or even 3 interceptors would be needed per each incoming missile.
Wow.
Although standoff missiles...
80% is still super impressive, especially for a fast-moving target.
Strikes would hardly make a dent on the massive battlefield with hundreds of thousands of various targets. They would slow down the enemy and temporarily shut down some bases and factories. Weeks would be needed to fire them all, with some targets getting repaired in the meantime. Japan too has some PAC-3 missiles, but their biggest addition would really be their own protective shield. Besides their air force, they have a robust SAM network, and their naval ships add many more anti-air systems as well. If China tried to use its air force in a continuous campaign against the US and Japanese forces on the Japanese mainland, it would face bigger numbers, better tech, and a lot of SAM systems against it. Long term, it would be suicidal for China. So it would probably save those planes for only occasional strikes of opportunity, for defense, and perhaps for taking out some key bases closer to China, like Okinawa and some of the other nearby islands, bombing them and attempting assaults on them. The Chinese landing fleet has been growing over the decades and is very much suited to disembark tens of thousands of troops to such nearby locations. After some months, once the US assembles its assets in huge numbers, the blue side would commence its campaign into China. But there's a lot of defenses the US would need to go through before they could hope to reach the Chinese shores. Chinese naval expansion has focused a lot on air defenses. Their fleet is now capable of projecting a defensive SAM umbrella some distance from the coastline. Even the frigates are capable, as they use missiles that cover altitudes of some 12 miles up. Basically, no US non-stealthy plane could fly close to them without getting threatened. The US would likely take it very slow with their invasion. Pushing too much at once usually means too many unnecessary casualties. Even if China takes some islands, there would be no rush to take them back. But the Chinese Navy would likely stick to their shores and enjoy the added protection of their air forces, and even their land-based air defenses. And China does have a lot of those. Even the older systems could come in handy, of course, as there might not always be enough jammers and decoys available for the US.
Oh my god.
Lot of those. Even the older systems could come in handy, of course, as there might not always be enough jammers and decoys available for the US. If the approach routes to China are limited by a lack of allied countries, most of those SAMs could be concentrated in a fairly small area, providing formidable overlap defenses. Early warning and airborne radars would add to the shown figure. The concentration of SAMs and radars might initially be such that even stealth aircraft could not hope to fly over the coastline without getting so close to a radar that would either threaten them directly or would direct fighter interceptors to them. Besides the ground warning network, China has been improving their aerial radar fleet. While the very local situational awareness in an air battle might be...
So far, it does seem like China are really holding their own. You know, it seems that technologically the US appear to have the edge in terms of just how advanced their systems are, but you know, it does appear that China has some really good technology of its own.
On the US side, due to the technology edge, the broader situational awareness might favor the Chinese. They would have many land, sea and air-based radars tracking the enemies. The closer the US would go to the Chinese coastline, the less it could depend on both sea-based and air-based radars like AWACS. Massive air battles would ensue, at first near the coastline. While the US might very well have more planes fairly nearby, in actual localized clashes there might be instances where the Chinese fighters outnumber them. That's because sending 1,000 fighters at once and organizing them all to receive ample in-air refueling would be way too unwieldy. Adding in Chinese SAMs, the US force going for the coastline might have to rely on tech superiority rather than on numbers. Numbers here are totals of active service planes for both sides. Not all would be available for missions at the same time, especially for the US. The list shown is rough, so two planes within the same rank are not necessarily of the same capability. Both sides would use bombers as missile trucks. Only the stealthy US B-2s might try flying over targets, and sometimes...
But would they be able to, you know, even with how advanced the B-2 is, would it be able to stay undetected and make it back to base? Because that is, I believe, each B-2, you know, I don't think there's that many in service. They're very valuable. You would hate to lose one.
Remaining alive. The US tech edge over China has been eroding. Chinese are equipped with very modern missiles, radars and jammers. Given the other factors as well, the US might be losing a dozen planes per day.
Wow.
Positive kill rates against Chinese planes would not be assured. But the US does have more planes. At some point, probably well past the 6 months mark, the Chinese air forces would be severely depleted and unable to control the skies near the coastline, while the US would likely still have some 2,000 combat planes remaining, depending on the size of its overall alliance. While China could save some of its forces by simply not trying to protect the coastline, it would be disastrous for its economy in the long run. A huge chunk of everything important in China is located near the coastline. Both sides' navies would suffer major losses during the said time frame. To be efficient, the US carriers would need to get close. Many escort ships would likely suffer defending those carriers. Inevitably, at least a few US supercarriers themselves would get sunk. And if the US Navy presses on too early, even half of the US carrier fleet might be neutralized. The Chinese have over the years assembled a dedicated network for locating and tracking carriers. Out in the ocean, that would be harder, but within the first island chain, satellites, underwater sonar networks, various drones and probably the most powerful coastal-based anti-shipping force in the world would inflict serious losses. US submarines would be most lethal at torpedo ranges. Neighboring seas are not ideal for fast attacking submaneuvers. They're shallow and the subs can't dive deep to hide beneath the thermocline layer, which usually protects subs from long-range sonar.
So guys, let me know in the comment section, based on what you've heard, let me know if you think the US is going to be successful in this mission, to take China. Because the thing is, even though right now it's super close, it's extremely close, this video doesn't take into account the technology that the US hasn't made public. I'm sure there's various weapon systems, innovations that are, kept secret. But likely that's the same for China too. So yeah, let me know what you guys think.
In open oceans, the Chinese have also built up their anti-submarine capabilities. Most of their new large ships have towed and variable depth sonars, and half of their corvettes are of the anti-submarine variant. Aerial assets would aid in the submarine hunt in the opening stages of the war, while the Chinese numbers could still provide cover. Threat levels and the fact US destroyers might not be risked going forward to hunt for Chinese subs would mean the US subs would largely rely on airborne protection only, or they wouldn't go so close to China at all. In theory, the US does have a vast fleet of anti-submarine aircraft, but only a small portion of those might survive operating near Chinese shores. China's own submarines are mostly diesel-electric, but they wouldn't need to sail far. They could practically wait or very slowly and silently prod forward, hoping to ambush the enemy ships or subs. Depending on just how aggressive the US Navy would be with their submarine use, perhaps even half of the US subfleet might perish before the war ends. Of course, much of the Chinese Navy would be sunk by then. Besides taking back Okinawa, the US might take South China Sea islands. Over the decades, Chinese have built up whole islands on some rocks there. There are at least 7 island bases, with 3 to 4 being able to operate combat aircraft. They are sort of unsinkable and repairable aircraft carriers, but that all applies up until the point the islands themselves can be kept supplied. Months into the war, when the Chinese Air Force is forced to retreat, those islands would become a liability. The Chinese Navy could try to protect them on its own, but it would be exposed to still plentiful US forces. Eventually, China would likely retreat from those islands. The islands are tiny and not fit to support many troops over a long time on their own. They would also come in handy to the US after it takes them.
Because that's another bunch of nearby bases, of nearby places that you can station troops or weapons.
Become staging grounds for an attempted invasion of Hainan Island. Why there? Because islands are inherently easier to take than actually disembarking on the Chinese mainland. It would still be a huge undertaking. Hainan is close to the mainland. The nearby peninsula does mean the mainland connection is small and would likely be cramped with various hardware. It would be easier for US air power to suppress. The island itself is huge, very populated and with its own production. There could very well be a few 100,000 Chinese troops there, stocked in advance to last for years. Additional resupply by small low-flying aircraft or tiny boats would likely go on despite US efforts, as the US would not be able to park its ships right next to the Chinese mainland. The US assault force is fairly large, but it too has limits. The airborne assault force would still be somewhat limited by distance, even using the newly captured SCS airfields. The US might fall short of the troop numbers needed to secure a beachhead.
I see.
Assuming an optimistic 75% of all amphibious ships and 50% of plane fleet capacity, the first wave might hope to land some 50,000 troops, with subsequent waves landing much fewer, as more and more supplies need to be landed as well.
Yeah, food especially, right? Because you have to feed those men and women.
Though the bigger issue would be continuous losses to the US landing ship fleet. Compared to the Normandy landings, for example, the US would not nearly be enjoying the same air superiority, control of the littoral waters, the same element of surprise, or even local numerical superiority on the ground. It's likely such an assault would either fail, ending in 100,000 US soldiers lost, or succeed sort of, losing almost as many US soldiers, the professional core of the US assault force, and many of its hardware assets. all for taking one island and neutralizing or capturing 300 or so thousand Chinese troops. In the grand scheme of things, it would mean the US would be unable to attempt such a huge-scale assault anywhere else for a year, and China would have plenty of time to train replacement troops. Is there a better place to perform a landing? No, but of all the worst places, the Shandong Peninsula might be the least bad. It too would prevent China from attacking the landed force from many sides. It's even fairly close to Japan, so the infrastructure supporting the planes and ships making cycles to Shandong might allow for somewhat quicker accumulation of a larger landing force. The problem is, the Chinese forces channeled there would basically have no limits to their numbers. All the heavy hardware, like artillery and tanks, could be sent there and supplied, and China has a big edge in heavy hardware compared to the US.
Yeah, because I'm sure the US, especially with the M1 Abrams, that would be a massive asset to have, but just bringing that over, 70 tons per tank, it would be much harder to bring over the total, the total amount of tanks that the US has compared to China, who already has them. Obviously, they're in China. Yeah.
Especially to what the US could actually land on enemy shores. As aircraft would basically land only very light vehicles, and even the ships would be landing a few hundred tanks and IFVs at best. Artillery firepower actually landed on the beaches would also be lacking for the US. Attack helicopters would be few in numbers, mostly Marine Corps assets, with only some Army Apaches. The US forces would eventually be driven into the sea, with US local firepower significantly lacking. The US Air Force would be roughly halved by then. What's left of it would be operating over quite some distance to support the landings. That means even fewer planes actually on patrol for combat air support. Ships that would be close enough to provide artillery cover would also be close enough to be hit by Chinese missiles. So, would reaching Beijing even be feasible for the US? No. While some extra level of surprise could be had if the US tried landing elsewhere, ultimately it would mean a longer route to Beijing and a landing zone that's even farther away from US bases, meaning a smaller landing force fighting a Chinese response force that would not be limited by the constraints of a peninsula.
Exactly, the Chinese force would be huge. It would be everybody that they have, because Beijing's the capital. The Chinese are going to defend that with everything.
Realistically, the only way to successfully go into China and reach Beijing would be by a multi-year war, amassing allies and amassing a huge land force to fight through via a long, bloody land route, counting on industrial supremacy of the alliance. Would that actually be politically possible is very questionable. The Chinese Navy and most of its air force could be defeated, especially when it comes to power projection. But using outside force, most likely China could not be defeated by a foreign land army. But realistically speaking though, a locked-in China with its economy and industry devastated would already be a defeated China. Oh, and
Very interesting, and yeah, to be honest, from around the 1/3 way mark, I was kind of getting the vibe that it was going to be a very, very difficult undertaking for the US, just because, it's the fact that the US had to bring all of its troops or bring all of the weaponry it could, whereas China has that all there available, ready to be used, ready to be deployed. The US would be limited by how much it could carry realistically. Whereas if they were to meet, the US and China maybe at a neutral zone with everything they had, then it could go extremely differently. Really interesting. Obviously, this is just Binkov Battlegrounds opinion. Realistically, if this were to take place, it could go very differently. Who knows? But very interesting. I love these little war games. They're kind of fascinating just to watch unfold. Hopefully, it never comes to pass, because I prefer these peace times that we currently live in. But fascinating nonetheless. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, turn on bell notifications, and keep throwing the recommendations my way. I know I say it all the time, but they genuinely help me out, because if I know you enjoyed watching something, I'll definitely enjoy reacting to it. So like, subscribe, turn on bell notifications. keep throwing the recommendations, and I'll catch you in the next one.